Today we're in Psalm 91, and even though there's no mention of the author at the start, it's most likely that this was written by Moses as well. And back in Psalm 90 and verse 1, Moses said, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations." And it seems like Psalm 91 is expounding on that idea. What does it mean for God to be our dwelling place? And in Psalm 91 and verse 1, he says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty." Moses wrote these Psalms in the context of the wilderness period in which they had no king, no temple, no land, and they're out exposed to the elements in the wilderness, completely vulnerable to the dangers of life. And yet Moses could say, "We are safe with you, God." In fact, a good way to summarize the purpose of this psalm is that the shelter of God's shadow shields us from life's snares. It's a beautiful image because when you're out in the wilderness, you are exposed to the scorching heat. And when you find even a small sliver of shade, you find life and protection and safety. I'm wondering if Moses is also thinking about the pillar of cloud that led them through the wilderness by day, because underneath that cloud coverage, they had miraculous shade from God. And so as long as you're underneath the shelter of God's protection, you have nothing to fear in the wilderness, and that any snares that may trap you and kill you, God will not allow them to defeat you. In verses 2 and 3, "I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust, for it is he who delivers you from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence." There are so many dangers mentioned in this psalm, and those dangers are described as snares, as if Satan is trying to capture them and kill them. One of those dangers is pestilence, and more of those dangers are listed in verses 5 and 6. You got the fear of the darkness at night, and the fear of enemy armies shooting arrows at you by day, and there's pestilence mentioned again, and maybe destruction from the heat that lays waste to you in the middle of the day. The references to pestilence and darkness harken back to the 10 plagues on Egypt. In fact, he uses that language in verse 10 when he says, "No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent." Remember how it was for Israel in Egypt. All of the Egyptians were suffering under the plagues of God, and yet the Israelites were sheltered and protected from those plagues as they dwelled under the shadow of the Almighty. In verse 4, he's pictured as an eagle covering his babies with his feathers, protecting them from the dangers of this world. And his faithfulness to protect his own is like a shield and a bulwark. This is a reference to the small shield that you would have tied around your arm, and also a larger rectangular shield that covered more of your body. So you had one shield that was used to protect you while you were going on the offense, and another shield to protect you while you're on defense. But the point is, you are safe with God. And even in verse 7, if 1,000 or 10,000 people fall all around you, God can protect you so that out of 10,000 people, you're the only one unharmed if you trust in him. In fact, he will give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all your ways, verse 11. And that harkens back to Exodus chapter 23 and verse 20, when God told Israel, "Behold, I am going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared." The Bible is clear that God uses angels as ministering servants to do his will and to protect his holy people. And of course, we don't know exactly how that works, but it's a tremendous comfort. And he's telling Israel in Exodus 23, "Not only will I guard you in the wilderness on the way to the promised land, but I will send that angel ahead of you to fight for you so that you will have the victory." In fact, they'll protect us so well in verse 12 that they'll keep us from striking our foot against a stone. That seems like such a small thing, but if you're in the wilderness and you injure your foot, that makes it really hard to travel. And if your foot gets cut on that rock, it can cause an infection. And all of that can slow the group down and make you vulnerable to attack from your enemies. And yet God's angels don't just prevent us from getting hurt. They give us victory over our enemies so that we tread upon even the most ferocious of beasts, the lion and the serpent. And now in verses 14 to 16, God himself speaks, and he agrees with everything Moses has said here. God says, because he has loved me, therefore I will deliver him, and I will set him securely on high, because he has known my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer him, and I will be with him in trouble, and I will rescue him and honor him with a long life. I will satisfy him and let him see my salvation. Now, some have struggled with this psalm because it makes it sound like if you trust in God, nothing bad will ever happen to you, and you'll never be harmed in any way at all. But a couple things to note here. First of all, this is poetry. It's meant to be exaggerated language to express the mercy and grace and protection of God for his people. It's not that God's people will never get sick or die, but that God always comes through for his people. First of all, most of the time, he does protect his people from the snares of life in ways that the wicked are not protected. But even when the righteous do suffer and are caught in snares and do get sick and die, God will still deliver them spiritually. And notice in verse 15, God says, I will be with him in trouble. He doesn't say that you'll never experience any trouble or difficulty in this life, but that I will be with you in it and rescue you through it. In the end, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, they didn't say, look, God promised we'll never be harmed, so we're going to be just fine. No, they said, we trust that God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't deliver us from this flame, we're still going to serve him. Why? Because they knew even if the flame killed them, God would still rescue them and resurrect them in honor in the end. And I think Psalm 91 is exactly what God's people need to hear right now, because they've been hauled off into Babylonian captivity and they're surrounded by dangers and snares all around them. It's like they've been exiled to the wilderness, just like their Israelite ancestors. And so Moses assures them, even though they're in the wilderness right now and they have no king and no temple and no land, and they're surrounded by dangers everywhere they look, if they'll take shelter in the shadow of the Most High, they'll be shielded from life's snares. And actually, verse 11 should give them great hope that just as God's angels took care of their forefathers in the wilderness and brought them safely to the promised land, so too God's angels can protect his people in captivity in Babylon and bring them back into the promised land and return home where they belong. And so the practice for us is to dwell in God's shadow. And in order to do that, it means we have to get close to him. You cannot be shaded by someone's shadow unless you're right up next to them. So this isn't about visiting God occasionally or looking upon him from a distance. It's about walking side by side in close communion. And when we do that, it'll be like a cloud follows us around everywhere we go. And that sounds weird to us because we're used to the cartoons. And when you see a cloud following a cartoon character around, usually that's a bad thing because it's just raining on them all the time, no matter where they go. But when the shelter of God's cloud and glory follows us around, we have shade and protection from the scorching heat of life and its snares. And it doesn't mean nothing bad will ever happen to us, but when they do, many times God will actually keep us safe from it physically, just like he protected Israel from the plagues while the Egyptians all around them suffered. But even if he doesn't deliver us from harm and death in this life, his shelter extends beyond this life to bring us safely to the next, where we'll abide in the shelter of his shadow forever, which means we don't have to live our lives in fear. And this points to Jesus in a couple of ways. Number one, during his ministry, he presented himself as the Almighty One in whose shade we should take shelter. In Matthew 23, Jesus said to Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Jesus is taking verse 4 of Psalm 91 and he's applying it to himself. And it also points to Christ because when he was in the wilderness being tempted for 40 days, Satan quoted verse 11 to him. And he told him, look, if you're the Son of God, just jump off the temple, and God will give his angels charge concerning you to guard you in all of your ways, and he won't let you die. Satan interpreted Psalm 91 as a blank check that you can do whatever you want, and God will just protect you, and nothing bad will ever happen to you. And Jesus knew that's not what this text meant. In fact, Jesus was suffering greatly in the wilderness because of his fasting, and yet he knew the Lord was with him in trouble, just like verse 15 says. He believed that verse and did not need to put God to the test to prove that he was with him. And because of it, Jesus conquered Satan in the wilderness and fulfilled Psalm 91, because 2 verses later in verse 13, it says, you will tread upon the lion and cobra, the young lion and the serpent you will trample down. So by taking refuge in the shade of his Father in the wilderness, he wasn't protected from pain and suffering, but he did conquer the serpent. And then in Matthew 4 and verse 11, it says, the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him. So we praise God for his life-giving shade and for sending his Son to teach us what it means to take shelter in his shadow. And our prayer today is, Father, help me draw close to you so I can take shelter under your shadow and be rescued from life's snares. Help me not to walk in fear, because you send your angels before me. And thank you for sending Jesus to give me eternal shelter in the shadow of the cross.